Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing on with the If We're Being Honest fic. This will be Part 8, Chapter 8, entitled Sunshine. Kyoka was really worried about Shinso, but didn't let it show until he finally left with Aizawa. Once he was gone, she pretty much turned into a crying mess, along with pretty much everyone else. She knew that she normally wasn't an emotional person. She was supposed to be a rock, the sturdy friend, the one that lightened the mood, the one that never wavered and was there to lean on whenever she was needed, but she couldn't help it. Figuring out how horribly he had been treated made something deep inside her shatter into 1,000,001 pieces. Maybe it was the fact that she had been the one to realize how horrific his past really was. Maybe it was the fact that he looked like he expected to be hit at every sudden moment. Maybe it was the way that he had clung to Aizawa like a child that never really received any love. It wasn't pretty, he had said, but she just couldn't stop crying. Maybe it was just because this was the last straw, because it was just him, wasn't it? No, it was so many of them. Midori was a victim of their quirk society, and so was Kirishima, whom she had thought to be so strong in his own confidence. Hell, even Bakugou had been raised to believe that he was better than everyone else for so long just because of his quirk, and now he was left with a weird mix between a superiority and inferiority complex, which she knew he would never admit under threat of death. And Todoroki. Oh God, Todoroki. She started crying even harder when she thought about him all over again. Everyone had tried to put on a brave face for Todoroki when he was still there the other night, but as soon as he had gone to bed, most of them had immediately gone off to the deep end in terms of emotional distress. So many of them hadn't slept that night, and even Kyoka had left out a few tears because at that point her heart was still being held together by a few frayed strings. Until tonight, when those strings finally snapped. Why did everything have to be so fucking awful? Hey, Momo said when she saw Kyoka's silent crying turn into silent sobs. She put an arm around her and didn't really try to mask her own tears. It's going to be all right. Kyoka nodded silently as she rested her head on Momo's chest and wrapped her arms around her, not caring how ridiculous she looked. The taller girl had started getting a bit fuller these past few weeks, which is incredible. She had been dangerously underweight, and only because her parents had had her on that fucking ridiculous diet. With her quirk, that's just a huge problem. Kyoka had nearly gone and kicked her parents' asses when she'd found out about it. This thing really is just a crying quirk, Kyoka said with a small shrug. I mean, really, that's all it's good for. Amen to that, Kaminari said dazedly. He wasn't looking too hot himself, tear tracks painting his face like some damn watercolor piece. Do you think he'll be okay? Midori asked softly. He, as per usual, looked the worst out of all of them, because of course he did. Kyoka almost smiled at how compassionate he really was, and how much he cared about them all. I'm sure he will be, Kyoka said, doing her best to sound steady. It didn't really work. Aizawa won't let him get hurt anymore, and we won't either. They sat there for a long time, but they didn't watch any more movies that night. She had a feeling that they wouldn't be sleeping any time soon. The next morning during class was when they all saw Shinso again, when he arrived with Aizawa right before the bell rang. Kyoka tried her best not to stare at him as he went to his seat, but she probably wasn't doing a very good job. He surprisingly didn't look that bad. In fact, he looked more well-rested than she had seen him in a long time, which was more than she could say about herself, at least. When homeroom ended, everyone basically swarmed him. Are you okay? Was the first thing out of her mouth, which was pretty much what everyone else was asking, too. I'm all right now, I promise. He said this with a smile, and Kyoka felt her shoulders, and vaguely saw all of her classmates, too, literally sag in relief. Aizawa's adopting me, so that's nice. He's what? Kaminari screeched. I knew it. Shoto, that's not the same thing, Midoriya said with an eye roll. It was later this week when it happened. So many secrets had been spilled that Kyoka wasn't sure why it caught her so off guard. Maybe it was because she was so sleep-deprived. Maybe it was the fact that she truly wasn't expecting this one. Todoroki had always been somewhat sad, as had Shinso, and maybe all the others had been shocking, but this one was a whole other level entirely. Maybe it was because it was her best friend this time. This is the third time this week that you've forgotten your homework, Aizawa deadpanned. I get that you actually forgot it since you can't lie, but why can't you just, I don't know, put it in your bag? Snickers rose throughout the class as Kaminari smiled sheepishly. "I guess I'm just that airheaded, sir," he said, matter-of-factly. Aizawa rolled his eyes. "I know you think this is a joke, but are you at the top hero school in the country? You know that, right? Try a little harder, okay?" "I am trying, sir," Kaminari said, a little more serious. Nobody picked up on the change, though, since the smile was still half on his face. She should have noticed. Maybe she didn't because she was so tired. Damn it, she should have noticed a long time ago. "Well, you need to try harder. It's not like it's going to be like this when you go pro. Missing paperwork could mean legal repercussions, not just grades. You need to start taking these classes seriously." "I am taking them seriously," Kaminari yelled, smile suddenly gone. "I'm trying so hard." Kyoka felt her mouth drop open faster than it had in her life. It was like a switch had been flipped in the electric user. 1 second he was the happy-go-lucky guy, and the next he was staring at Aizawa like he'd been told his entire family was dead. What was going on? Kaminari looked down at his desk, seemingly unaware of the tension and questioning stares around him. "I'm trying so hard," he repeated quietly. "And no one ever notices. They just notice how much I fail. I don't know what's wrong with me. Everyone else can do all this stuff without a problem." He stopped to glare up at Aizawa, but the look was so full of pain that it probably didn't have the effect that he'd been wanting. No one else stares at their textbook for hours without even seeing it. No one else has to laugh off their stupidity because they don't even understand why they don't understand anything. Aizawa looked at the boy with wide eyes. "Kaminari." He continued like he didn't even hear him, though, slamming his fist into the table so hard that Kyoka felt herself flinch, though she knew that it had nothing to do with her quirk or how loud it had been. "And I have to play dumb, too, because if I'm good at some things, then that means if I'm not good at other things, I'm not trying hard enough. So everyone will always see me as the dumb blonde that no one will understand." "Kaminari," Aizawa said again, obviously at a loss at the sudden shift in his student. "I'm sure that's not true." "Of course it's true," Kaminari said bitterly, but it mostly just sounded like a statement of sad acceptance. "I'm under a truth quirk. I can't lie. I know what they all think of me. They all openly call me dumb. Idiot friend all the time. Why does no one else's brain skip from one idea to the other? Why am I like this?" Was Kaminari crying? "I hate myself most of the time," he said as a tear rolled down his cheek and landed on the desk. "I can't do anything right, and don't even get me started on my quirk." "Do you really think all that?" Kyoka found herself whispering. Was that a lump in her throat? Was she about to cry, too? Oh, wait. Her vision was blurry. She already was. Hadn't she cried enough already? Hadn't she had her heart broken enough for one lifetime? Kaminari jolted like he had forgotten they were all still there. Usually that would have been funny, but now... "Oh, now I've done it," he said weakly, standing up abruptly. "Can't even remember where I am anymore." "Kaminari, wait!" But her voice died in her throat because the blonde was already out the door, book bag forgotten. "What was that?" Kirishima asked shakily, like everything didn't just change in a heartbeat for the 100th time. Everybody walked back to the dorms together, with the exception of their happy-go-lucky electric friend, although now Kyoka could only think of how much that must have been an act. Not many words were exchanged, but Kyoka didn't mind. Her thoughts were running too fast for a conversation like that. Her mind flashed to every instance she had made fun of Kaminari for his lack of book smarts, or street smarts, or any sort of smarts. She hadn't meant any of it, of course she hadn't. He was one of her best friends, but she also remembered all the other times everyone in the class had done the same, over and over and over, and maybe Kyoka had believed the teasing, deep down, that he was honestly dumber than the rest of them just because he couldn't focus on a textbook. God, what had she been thinking? Kaminari had every right to be mad at them, but instead he had chosen to place the hatred on himself. That was absolutely ridiculous, but if Kyoka had somewhat believed it when only joking about it in passing, what did being told he was dumb every second of every day do to his subconscious? Was this something new at UA, or has this been going on for even longer? Some of the words Kaminari had said hit her like a punch to the gut as she remembered them, and it was just as painful as hearing him for the first time, if not more so. "They just notice how I fail." And really, he was right. Nobody had ever said a word to him if he did something right, unless it was to mock him for not doing something wrong. Of course it's true. He really thought all of that was true. Kyoka remembered something Bakugou had said about how You could think something was true and still say it even if it was completely false. I know what they all think of me. She was going to punch herself in the face. I think you were right, Todoroki suddenly said at the back of the group. Midoriya sighed. Yeah, probably. You knew about it? Shinso suddenly hissed, rounding on the green-haired teen. You knew that he— Oh, no, not about that, Midoriya said quickly, waving his arms around like he always did. I just have this idea. It's only a theory. We don't actually know if it's happening or if it's just speculation or if this whole thing is just getting us in the worst ways or— Deku, shut up and get to the point, Bakugou deadpanned. He looked just as emotionless as always, but Kyoka could see the hint of distress in his eyes that he was actually trying so hard to hide. Oh, right, Midoriya rubbed the back of his neck. And just so you know, Aizawa said not to tell you, so please don't get mad. Deku. All right. The quirk isn't just affecting our words, it's affecting our emotions. Nobody spoke for the longest time. Kyoka felt like her brain was imploding on itself. That explains so much, Kirishima finally said. Like, so much. And you just let us what? Shinso said, clearly a bit ticked off, and Kyoka winced at the thought of his panic attacks the other day. This really did explain a lot. Think we were emotionally overwhelmed for no reason? I'm really sorry, Midoriya said quietly. Aizawa said since there's no actual proof, it wasn't the best idea to say anything, and that it would only make everyone feel worse. Well, that's fair, she found herself saying, not bothering to stop herself from sounding just as angry as Shinso. I definitely feel worse. Because really, it made so much sense. Everyone was so much more emotional than they usually were, herself included. It explained Shinso's panic attacks and Kirishima's breakdown and ever-stoic Todoroki crying his eyes out over a long-dead brother. It explained Kaminari crying over a piece of homework. So what is it even doing? She asked, trying not to sound shaken. Is it hyping up our negative emotions or something? I don't think so, Midoriya said, because of course it wasn't that simple. I think it's amplifying all of them. Not amplifying them per se, and not just the bad either, since so many people confess feeling for each other so fast, in a sense that we can't lie to ourselves that how we feel is how we feel about something. Like when something horrible happens and you push it down. It's like when PTSD develops, we just can't ignore the bad feelings now. That's so ridiculous, Bakugou yelled. So if we have repressed trauma, it'll just bubble to the fucking surface? It makes sense, Tokiyama said suddenly. The darkness often has a way of showing up when we least expect it. Oh, can it with your emo shit. So that was why she confessed to Momo. Kyoka couldn't help but wonder if their whole new relationship was built on some quirk-based lie. She didn't want the only good thing to come from all this to be some twisted trick. She didn't want to wonder for the rest of her life if Momo really loved her or if she was just whacked up on some toddler's power. Hey, I know what you're thinking, Momo said quietly, grabbing her hand and squeezing it. No, this wasn't forced onto us. It's our true feelings, just dug up a little bit. Kyoka nodded, trying to keep her composure, which was a little easier now, if only because she knew why she was so upset, and that helped fill her with anger instead. Yeah, you're right. You and that big brain of yours, she said somewhat teasingly. Momo simply smiled fondly and bumped their shoulders together. Guys, Kirishima said, and Kyoka looked over and saw heartbreak in his eyes. If we can't lie to ourselves, and it's all true, then Kaminari— Kyoka felt her stomach plummet right back to the floor. Kaminari really felt that way. Maybe he lied to himself a lot, or maybe he just felt like that all the time. She hoped it was the former, and the thought made her feel better for a moment. But then Kyoka remembered something else he had said. I hate myself most of the time. So no, it wasn't the quirk, and even if it was still his true feelings coming to light, which somehow might have been worse, because then he would have been lying to himself about being happy. Why am I like this? He had asked. Kyoka wanted to give him a hug and tell him he was amazing, just the way he was, but she couldn't. He was gone because she had pushed him away. Denki was going to pass out. He was going to fall over and die, he was sure of it. Although, could he fall over if he was already on the floor? He supposed he could if he tried hard enough. His breathing was on hyperdrive, but somehow he still wasn't managing to get enough air into his lungs. He started feeling lightheaded, and a rush of fear went through him at the thought of one of his classmates finding him passed out on the ground. He didn't need them to think that he was even more pathetic than he already was. Unfortunately, stubbornness was not his forte, unlike Bakugou. He still struggled to intake air, like the knock-off, broken-down vacuum cleaner he was, and was probably very close to actually keeling over. He barely heard the knock on the door right behind him. "Kaminari?" That was Kirishima. His voice was soft, like he was approaching a frightened animal. "You in there, bro?" He tried to tell him to leave, that he was fine, which he knew wouldn't have come out of his mouth regardless, but because that would be the biggest lie of the night. But a wheeze just escaped him instead. He wasn't sure how loud it was, but from the sharp intake of breath behind him, it must have sounded pretty bad. "Hang in there, Kami," Kirishima said. "Can we come in? Knock on the door if we can." He felt his head start to spin. He wasn't sure, but he thought that he heard whispered words outside the door. Oh, right. Kirishima had said we, hadn't he? He wasn't alone. Did Denki want to be alone? He wasn't sure. He was just pretty certain that if he kept breathing like this, he was going to tap out. Actually, his vision was getting dark, wasn't it? Maybe if he tried closing his eyes for a moment. He must have actually passed out like a frickin' loser, because the next thing he knew he was lying on the floor with a blob of red over his face. "Breathe in and out, okay?" They sounded panicked, and oh, that was Kirishima. He must have come in when he heard him slump over. At least that answered the stupid question of if he could fall over if he was already on the ground. He followed Kirishima's breathing, and it was much easier to control now that he had something to listen to and think, oh, that's normal, isn't it? He managed to get his head to stop spinning and his eyes to focus again, and he saw the worried face of his friend above him. He shifted his gaze to see the rest of their friends, who all looked more or less the same. Shinso was closest, whose eye bags seemed much deeper than they had that morning, and Sero and Bakugou were right behind him. The angry blonde actually looked concerned for once, which nearly made him laugh, but his lips only quirked upwards a tiny bit before crashing right back down. Jiro was in the hallway, like she was scared to get closer for some reason, and she looked wrecked, which he hadn't been expecting. Great. Was she going to pity him now, or was his true concern? She had looked just the same the other night when Shinso had revealed his oh-so-wonderful past, so maybe she really did care. She was his best friend, after all. "You good?" Kirishima asked somewhat breathlessly. Denki looked back over to see him still staring at him intently with heavy concern. He mustered up enough energy to give him a smile. "Other than clonking out on the ground?" Bakugou snorted. "He's fine, idiots." "Oh, you had us so fucking worried," Sarah said, bringing a hand to his forehead like he was going to pass out next. "We were just talking and then Jiro heard you just fall." "We're just glad you're okay," Shinso said rather softly, leaning back on his ankles in relief. "I don't know what we would have done if you weren't." "He's not okay," Jiro suddenly hissed. "Do you not remember why we came up here in the first place?" If Denki could have frozen, he would have, but he already wasn't moving. Still, it felt like ice had been poured into his veins and down his back. "They meant physically, genius," Bakugou said, and Denki could practically hear the eye roll without even looking at him. "I know that," she said, twisting her earlobes aggressively, "but he's still not okay." "Are you okay?" Kirishima asked him instead of arguing with her, worry still ever present in his eyes. "You know, emotionally or whatever." Denki started to sit up. All of them jolted when they wanted to push him right back down. He waved off their concern, but nonetheless took Kirishima's hand as he sat up and leaned up against the now open door. "Not really," he said against his will. "I thought that was pretty clear." Kirishima winced, and Jiro, who had come up around the corner, smirked slightly before all traces of happiness disappeared from her completely. And this wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be the friend that never stopped smiling. He was supposed to be the class clown, the one that other people depended on to lighten the mood, no matter how stupid it made him look. They didn't laugh with him the same way they did with others. With Denki, they were always laughing at him, not with him, which was okay because that was his role in the group. That was his part that he was meant to play. The dumb blonde that made them say, "Oh, Kaminari," like he was some sort of child. Yep, he was fine with it. But now they were all here, staring at him and knowing that no, he wasn't always happy. He didn't always want to be the dumb one. He didn't want to be looked down on just because he didn't understand geometry. He had been fine keeping this secret for most of the time, so what had happened? Maybe he was just so sleep-deprived from finding out about Shinso and even Todoroki. How he had lied awake at night, unable to sleep because he was just thinking about how awful it was. He knew a lot of other people in the class had been having the same problem, so maybe he wasn't that much of a mess. Regardless, he had still screwed up once more. Way to go, Denki. "I'm here!" A female voice suddenly screeched, followed by Mina barreling around a corner and almost falling to the floor from her momentum. She leaned down, hands resting on her knees, as she tried to control her rapid breathing. "I'm so sorry, She paused to gasp for air. "I had to change out my tampon." All the guys, Denki included, suddenly turned very red in the face. "TMI, Mina," Cero said rather uncomfortably when no one else spoke. And then, for some stupid reason, unknown reason, Denki laughed. He literally started crying from laughter, unable to stop the hysterics that escaped him. Soon everyone else was laughing too, even Bakugou, who was hiding his chuckles behind his hand. It was true what they said. The higher the stress, the more you laughed. It was just so ridiculous and unnecessary and so different than anything else that had come from the stupid quirk recently that they couldn't help it. It was nice, so nice to just laugh and not worry. Not worry about how his life was over, or how he was a failure, or how he was probably going to get kicked out of school if his grades didn't improve soon, or how his parents might fucking disown him if he flunked out of high school, or how all of his friends would turn their backs on him once they realized how much of a joke he really was. He realized he was the only one still laughing. Wait, no. His laughter had turned into sobbing. Wonderful. Hey, Kirishima whispered, reaching forward like he's going to hug him but stopping at the last minute, deciding to just put a hand on his shoulder instead. "It's all right, okay? It's going to be all right." Denki put his face in his hands and tried to stop the crying, which he was failing at miserably. He shook his head. But it's not." "And that's okay, too," Shinso said softly. Denki peeked through his fingers to see him kneeling next to him as well. "We can still help you make it okay." He shook his head again, trying not to choke on his tears. "I don't know how you can help me not be an idiot, but I appreciate the thought." "Oh, Kaminari," Jiro said suddenly, dropping down to the floor in front of him like her strings had been cut. It was what she often said, but the tone was completely different than usual. It was normally said in exasperation or even fondness, but now it was just tired and heartbroken. "You're not—" She took a shuddered breath, put a hand on his knee. "You're not an idiot." "Of course I am," he said, wiping at his eyes as he tried to physically force himself to stop crying. "That's what you all have been saying this whole time, right?" We weren't serious, man," Kirishima said quietly. You didn't seem to mind. You always seemed happy." "I guess I am sometimes," Denki said with a shrug. "Like, I am glad I can make you guys happy, and I'm happy when I'm with you, and I can pretend you see me as an equal." "What kind of bullshit is that?" Bakugou snapped. Denki looked over at him with wide eyes and saw that he was glaring at him. "Of course we see you as an equal. You're one of my best friends, and this group would not be the same without you." Everybody stared at him. God fucking damn it. He looked about ready to rip his own hair out. "This quirk makes me say one more stupid thing. I'm barricading myself in my room." Denki didn't care, because he was not crying even more now. Nope. He was looking at Bakugou through the tears in his eyes, like he wanted to give him the biggest hug in the history of hugs. "Can I hug you?" he asked anyway, despite the fact that he knew Bakugou absolutely did not do hugs, except for Kirishima, but that was a given. Bakugou looked like he wanted to punt him into the sun. Denki prepared for the worst. "Of course you can." And then he felt his jaw drop to the floor. Bakugou looked like regret had crashed and landed onto his chest, but nonetheless, begrudgingly, he opened his arms, because, try as he might to deny it, he was still telling the truth, and that made Denki's heart sore. Turned out that Bakugou was absolutely amazing at giving hugs. He found this out as he crashed into him and wrapped his arms around him, trying not to sob into his shirt. His strong arms felt so safe, and he suddenly found himself jealous of Kirishima's hug privileges. The rest of them were amazing huggers, too. They all piled on not too long after. "Oi, I said I'd give him a hug, not you lot." "Too late," Mina said in a sing-song voice. "We're here to stay, Blasty." Bakugou grumbled something under his breath about annoying pink-haired weirdos. "You know we're here for you, right, Kaminari?" That was Shinso, who was part of this weird hug pile, too, by the sounds of it. He also didn't really do hugs, so Denki was suddenly that much more grateful for his friends. He blinked the spontaneous moisture from his eyes. "I guess I know now." "All right, that's enough," Bakugou suddenly growled, not so forcefully pushing them all off. "I have limits, idiots." Kirishima smacked him on the arm. Bakugou gave him an incredulous look, and then proceeded to have a conversation with just facial expressions. The blonde finally groaned at their telepathic communication. "I didn't— Ugh, why is being no so hard? I don't mean you're actually an idiot, Dunsface. He shook his head slightly as if to clear the etch-a-sketch in his brain. "Kaminari. I just call you that because you're like my idiots, or whatever, because you always do the dumbest shit together, like prank Aizawa and get detention for a week. Denki laughed weakly. Yeah, that was pretty dumb, but his face? Priceless. You know I never meant it either, right? Jiro said at his side once more. She gently took his hand, and Denki looked up and saw the overwhelming guilt and tears in her eyes. It made his heart break a little once he got over his shock. I never meant to make you feel like that. I'm so sorry. He squeezed her hand reassuringly and wiped at his eyes with his free hand. It's not your fault, any of you. I've felt like this most of my life, like I'm behind everyone else, and every negative thing anyone says just hits me so much harder than it should. I just can't focus on anything important. I can't do anything right. Someone put a hand to his mouth to stop his rambling. He was immensely grateful, because he didn't want them to hear any more about his problems if he could help it. He vaguely realized that he was crying again as the hand disappeared. He followed his eyes and saw it connected to Mina on the other side. Then, Kami, I think you have ADHD. His mind was now blank. He had overused his quirk several times in a row. That's what it felt like, at least. What? ADHD, she said again, tilting her head, giving him a sad smile. It fits all your symptoms, like how you're always fidgeting with Ojiro's tail and, like, looking out the window during class. What do the windows have to do with anything? He asked, still not fully processing what she was saying. You can't focus because your brain works differently. She tapped her temple a few times. You don't produce enough serotonin or, like, dopamine. I can't remember. I just know because my brother has it. But he racked his brain, trying to figure out why a sinking feeling was suddenly engulfing his chest. That doesn't, like, exist. What? Shinso asked, bewildered. Why wouldn't it exist? It's like an excuse, right? He said, finally remembering. He was so young, and it was when his parents still had faith that he would do better in school when he got older. Mom, I was reading this book from the library, and I think I might have the thingy in it. A little version of him was speaking to his mom. Oh? His mother asked, smiling. And what's that? I think it's called ADHD. Her smile dropped immediately. That's not real, Denki, and even if it was, you don't have it. But I can't focus, and I can't sit still in class. That's just you being lazy, his father suddenly cut in, reading the newspaper in his big armchair. You just need to study more, and no son of mine is going to have some sort of mental disorder. You hear me? There was a dangerous edge to his voice then, so little version of him had quickly nodded. Okay, I'll try harder. I just have to try harder, he said, shrugging. Like Aizawa said, if I just put the damn paper in my bag. That's not what ADHD is, Kami, Zero said. It's not like you could have tried harder to remember your paper, or like you could have tried harder when you're already staring at a textbook with nothing to distract you. But I get distracted anyway. Exactly, Bakugou snapped. You're just wired all different. It's why my tutoring never fucking helps you, so I'm going to change the way I do it so you can actually learn shit for once. Denki just stared at him, and felt his chest begin to shake. You would... He stopped to wipe his nose with his sleeve. You would do that for me? Bakugou clicked his tongue. Of course I would. And this fucking quirk better end soon or I'm going to lose my mind. But you're so nice, Mina said, dragging out the last word and leaning on him dramatically. He promptly pushed her off with a scowl. You're all going to regret this. Sure we will, she said in a sing-song voice. You'll let us help you, right, Sparky? Jiro asked, looking back over at her, and saw that she was still an emotional mess, which was so bizarre to look at. Like, he didn't say anything in response. You'll let us help you with everything. He stared at her. He really didn't know she cared so much about him. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the book had said. It made sense. He was definitely hyperactive and majorly lacked attention, but he had also read about the other things. Inability to start projects or hear people correctly, or even thinking everyone hated you for no reason, or having a really bizarre memory, such as not remembering an important homework assignment, but remembering a random book that you read 7 years ago. Yeah, that tracked. What if you're all wrong? He muttered. What if it's all just in my head? And where the fuck else would it be? Up your ass? Bakugou said, exasperated. It's a fucking mental disorder. It's gonna be in your head. It was like a damn light bulb went off in his brain. Well, when you put it like that, I just sound dumb, he said, rubbing his head like it hurt from the revelation, which, to be fair, it kind of did. Damn it, you're not dumb, Kyoga exclaimed, and Denki almost flinched at her loud tone. If you say one more self-deprecating thing, I swear to... All right, I get it, he said with a laugh. He realized he was still holding her hand and gave it another squeeze. I'll try to, love myself, or whatever. Good. We've all missed your sunshine smile. She wiped a stray tear from her face and gave him a sly smile of her own. And we'll all yell at you when you don't. Okay, fair. He shook his head at her antics and realized another tear was trailing down his face. What is this with all this crying? He finally said. I mean, I get it. I'm sad, but, I don't ever cry this much, and I've never seen Jiro cry once in my life. It's like Midoriya said, Saru explained unhelpfully with a shrug. Emotions are stupid. Denki just stared at him. What the hell are you talking about? Oh my god, Mina groaned, slapping herself in the face. We forgot to tell him. Tell me what? Good going, morons. You didn't tell him either. Well, it's not my fucking fault Deku kept him to himself. Tell me what? They then explained it to him, and if Denki's brain was hurting before, it was exploding now. No fucking wonder. I think Kaminari's going to be okay. Izuku looked up from his textbook to see Shoto walking out of the elevator towards him. He automatically moved over so he could sit down, and promptly leaned his whole body on him once he did. That's a relief, he said. Who told you? I went by his room to go check on him, he said with a shrug. He didn't open the door. I didn't either, but it sounded like all of his friends were playing video games with him. They all sounded quite happy. That's good, Izuku said, putting his head on Shoto's shoulder as he closed his eyes. That's really good. I don't think I'd be able to handle any more breakdowns. I'm almost out of tears. He felt Shoto chuckle beside him. I don't think you could ever run out of those. Want to bet? Actually, no, I'll definitely lose. Shoto smiled lightly and put an arm over his shoulders. You just care so much, there's nothing wrong with that. Izuku reached over and grabbed his hand with a small shrug. I guess so. Hey, listen to me. Shoto squeezed his hand, and Izuku looked up to see a loving smile on his face that made his heart combust on sight. I mean it. You're wonderfully caring, and you'll make an amazing hero. I'm just glad you chose to love me. The last part seemed to be uttered against the dual-haired boy's will as he suddenly turned sheepish and bright red. Izuku hoped that he wasn't implying that he thought he wasn't good enough for him. You're right. I did choose to love you, and it makes me happy every single day. Shoto smiled once more, and it was brighter than his fire could ever hope to be. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while after that, simply existing together. Izuku continued to read his book while Shoto pulled out a tiny crossword puzzle. It was wonderful. So much better than what was about to happen. Afterwards, Izuku would desperately wish that he could go back to this moment and just sit in oblivious silence for a while longer, to have one more moment of peace before it was ripped away. They were having another movie night that night. They were practically every other day at this point, so they didn't bother to move as their classmates began to filter into the common room as dinner hours came and passed. It wasn't every night that they ate together, so on nights like tonight they simply ate whatever they could find. As it neared 7, the unofficial time that the movie nights had begun, the self-proclaimed Baku squad came out of the elevator doors, laughing and talking like nothing was wrong with the world. You lot are going to give me a headache, Katsuki muttered before heading off to the kitchen, most likely to heat up something he had already cooked. How are you feeling, Kaminari? Sue asked. She never really worried about awkwardness, that was for sure. I'm doing better, he said, smiling. We came to the conclusion that I probably have ADHD. He suddenly froze, like he definitely didn't want everyone to know about it. He opened his mouth back up, probably to try to brush it off. That's a very important thing to know about, Iida said with a nod. I would suggest asking Aizawa to help you get a formal diagnosis so UA can accommodate for your learning. Something shone in Kaminari's eyes as he stared at Iida in apparent shock. Izuku suddenly noticed the area around his eyes was slightly pink. Yeah, sounds good. Then Uraraka and Katsuki came into the room at the same time. They locked eyes with each other, and immediately tension spiked. Izuku really should have known this was coming. The girl hadn't been at all satisfied with what Katsuki had told them about his quirk, and even though he explicitly stated that he knew it was no excuse for the years of bullying, Uraraka was still not convinced in the slightest. It started out simple enough. Why is it you never got a detention for bullying, Deku? The sentence seemed to be asked against her will, but she knew that Izuku didn't want her to start anything. But she didn't seem all that apologetic, that she had even asked. I told you I was suspended, Roundface. And then it escalated. It escalated a lot. It escalated too much, too fast, that it left Izuku's head spinning dangerously as he tried to keep up with who was screaming at who. No one really took sides. They were all trying to calm the two of them down from the hellfire of anger that they were trapped in. But even then, a few people started to argue with Uraraka. They didn't even say he was bad now or that he was irredeemable asshole, just that he was probably got off a little easy for tormenting him. Even his own friends were starting to look a little unsure, and Izuku could tell that Katsuki saw it. Did any of them care that Izuku didn't care in the slightest? No. Did they care that he had already realized what he had done was bad? No. He had to suffer for his actions, apparently. Izuku was having none of it. That's bullshit. Uraraka turned to him with wide eyes. Whether it was from his words or the cursing, he wasn't sure. I'm not saying he had to be expelled or anything, Uraraka shouted before turning right back around. But have you ever had any real consequences for your actions? Katsuki glared at her, and a heat was radiating from him that seemed like nothing he had ever put off before. I damn well had consequences for my actions. Deku already told you. Yeah, well, calling your mommy wasn't enough of a punishment for breaking his arm. Izuku tried to reach out to her. Well, he got suspended also, right? And the school thought it was enough, so... Well, Uraraka said, rounding on Izuku and slapping his hand away. It's not good enough for me. Something inside Katsuki visibly snapped, like something deep inside him that had been shattered beyond repair. Somehow Izuku knew that something big was going to come out, as if the air around them was suddenly 20 degrees colder. Call it some sort of sixth sense, but he just knew. He just didn't realize how big it would be. So, getting beaten until I couldn't see straight and locked in a closet for 3 fucking days isn't good enough for you? The silence that followed his scream was deafening, and Katsuki took one look at everyone's shell-shocked faces before bolting right out the front door. And Izuku, funnily enough, was not out of tears. This concludes Chapter 8 of If We're Being Honest. Chapter 9 will be up next year for you guys, and hope y'all are still enjoying this one, but as always, thank you so much for listening.